I'm Lynn Fraser. I'm with the Kilby Center for Recovery, and I'm very happy to be talking today with Dr. Stephen Dansiger. And he's involved with Refuge Recovery and has a lot of experience that I think everybody will enjoy hearing about. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Steve, and let you introduce yourself.
Hello, everyone, and I'm really glad to be here. I'm glad to be able to share at length about all of these things that I'm passionate about, I'm working on, my colleagues around me are working on, and this is a wonderful opportunity for us to maybe take a new step into a new future for recovery in general. And just a little bit about myself. I'm a licensed MFT in California. I have a doctorate in clinical psychology. That doctorate, I focused on the role of spirituality in both the development of the etiology of complex post-traumatic stress disorder and also its treatment. So I've had that focus for a long time, and my introduction to the world of addiction was through participating in it myself, and entered recovery 28 years ago. And a few months, 4 months into my recovery, I was brought to an AA retreat at a Zen Buddhist monastery. And I got my first meditation instruction, and I've just never stopped. So I've been on this parallel and sometimes completely right in tune Buddhist path and recovery path. And so my first work that I did in sobriety was I was a high school English teacher in Brooklyn, New York. And there were race riots in the neighborhood where I was teaching the summer after my first year of teaching. And I sort of dove into the aftermath of that, and all these nonprofits came in and gave us all training on how to work with students and work with each other around those issues. And I was fascinated and hooked for a million different reasons that maybe would be another conversation. But
Really trial by fire.
It was like, hello, welcome.
Yeah.
First, welcome to Britain, which I'm from, so I understood that part. But yeah, welcome to the world. And so anyway, I ended up being part of a group that rewrote the curriculum for New York City public schools around leadership, violence prevention, anger management, conflict resolution. This is after a year after those riots, the Crown Heights riots. And so my introduction to the world of helping really was first around sponsorship and 12-step, but then professionally through teaching, and then teaching around these issues that were really about, now the way I frame it for myself is around institutionalized trauma. So I sort of learned that way. And then I moved to Los Angeles in 2002. And one of the first people that welcomed me here was an old friend from New York who happened to be running the outpatient at Promises in West LA. And she asked me to run a group. And I had never done anything like this. And I said, I'm not a therapist. And she said, that's okay. I need a life skills group. So you're an educator. So went into that, and that's it. And I went back to school. I was reeled in. And then I think the other important point in terms of starting our discussion about where I'm coming from and what I might have to offer is my supervisor for my MFT internship was an EMDR therapist, and so and an addiction specialist. So she was already using EMDR in that context, maybe in a way that, is over 10 years ago. So, there was less sort of being talked about, less known, and in a lot of ways she was doing cutting edge work in that way. Anyway, she brought me into that world, and I was completely, I said, oh, this is where the healing is. So I got trained, and so at this point, I'm an EMDRIA approved consultant. I'm a trainer with the Institute for Creative Mindfulness. I train EMDR therapists here in California and beyond. I've got a book coming out with my colleague whose institute I trained for about EMDR therapy and mindfulness.
Hmm.
for trauma-focused care, which is a great deal of my passion, moving from trauma-informed care to trauma-focused care.
Ah, no. Can you go into that a little bit? What you mean by that?
Absolutely. So, trauma-informed care it's a wonderful new standard of practice, and it comes from years of trauma theory and just psychological theory, and also all the other elements that those of us who are in the know, the spirit, the mind, body, spirit elements. Like one of the things that I like to think, the way I like to think is from a both and perspective rather than an either or perspective.
Hmm.
And so trauma informed is basically setting up your agency or your practice or even your engagement with someone in a way that will be the most potentially not triggering, just for starters,
Hmm.
let's not trigger someone. And then is educated and able to see and witness all the different ways that trauma affects the person that's in front of me or the people that are in front of me at the agency. And it really has become a standard of care in as much as SAMHSA put out guidelines, and I think they're actually excellent guidelines around this in 2014. Again, this is all so new. And as it applies to addiction treatment, we've been talking about this in the field ever since I've been in it. We talk about trauma, its effects, and what we might need to do about it. And so we've been informing ourselves for a long time. A lot of us in the field.
Hmm.
Now, the sort of the consensus seems to me to be that if you don't treat the trauma, you won't treat the addiction fully, and that the issue really is the trauma,
Hmm.
and that we're also working, this is working from a model of Pierre Genet, 1889, first described a three-stage model of trauma treatment.
Hmm.
And he was very committed to the idea that trauma or post-traumatic stress was implicated in most neuroses. And Freud kind of agreed with him at the beginning and then went off in his world.
Hmm.
And Genet is who Bessel van der Kolk, Gabor Mate, all the people who are talking about trauma now, that's who they picked up on. And really Francine Shapiro with EMDR, Peter Levine with somatic experiencing, everyone is putting forth this model of how to treat people.
Hmm.
So a lot of what it is trauma-focused care in the larger mental health perspective is okay, everyone is saying, or not everyone, it seems many people are saying that we need to focus on the trauma, treat the trauma, and then the rest of the diagnoses or the rest of the disorders, or take those words out of it, the rest of the dilemmas, the problems, will be revealed and healed. And so let's do that. So the question just becomes, how to do that. So uh, there's a number of people who have wonderful, I've just mentioned a few people who have proposed many different structures.
Hmm.
And so what I've come to from my years of Buddhist practice, my years of doing EMDR, my years of doing EMDR therapy in a treatment context, is that I sort of pulled back and took a 30,000 foot view and saw that you could use the 8-phase protocol of EMDR therapy to run the agency, to provide the context and the structure. You
Hmm.
know, one center might be a medical model, another center might be a 12-step model, and that doesn't take the other interventions out of the picture. It just makes that the core structure.
Hmm.
So trauma-focused is a way of saying that everyone who comes in to Refuge Recovery at this point, and a couple of other centers I'm working with on implementing this kind of structure, they come in and they're immediately seen as a trauma-focused therapy client. The language in EMDR therapy used to be, are they appropriate or not appropriate for EMDR? I'm coming from the belief that everyone is appropriate. It's just that it's going to take different people different lengths of time to get to the reprocessing. the reprocessing being what people picture and think about when they hear EMDR. You know, they think of the worst thing in the world and someone's going to wave their finger at me. So that is some of the phases of EMDR. It's actually one of the stages or two of the stages of EMDR therapy, that three-stage model. So the idea is that our goal becomes trauma resolution, adaptive resolution of post-traumatic stress, both related or not related to their addiction. And that by going in that focus, which I feel like I have a lot of backup for, research and also in some of the thought leaders that you've invited, that is the best direction going forward. And then the mindfulness piece is all through it, but in a lot of ways, it's proposed as the best practice for that first phase of stabilization and preparation for the possibility of the trauma resolution.
Right.
So that's why, at Refuge Recovery, they come in and immediately they're meditating, at least pretty much anywhere from, not all at once, but, anywhere from an hour to an hour and a half a day, And so, obviously we put a lot of other structures in place to support that. And we're also coming at it from using evidence-based approaches and from using the wisdom of Buddhist psychology, which is quite wise. So I know that was a lot of words in answer to your question, but that might be the way this goes.
Yeah, no, that's great. That's very much the approach of the Kilby Center as well, to treat the trauma first and then the addictions. I mean, if we don't have to escape from something, if we're able to be present with it, we don't have such a need to get away. So it makes it easier to work with the addiction.
Well, I went through my experience, going to that meditation retreat at the AA retreat at the monastery. It was actually the retreat theme was the promises. So I'm there, like we're talking about the promises of the 12 steps and of AA. And then I get my first meditation lesson and I'm like, why does my brain feel different? Like what's this focus that I was able to maintain for about 3.7 seconds, but it was pretty remarkable to me.
Yeah.
And then my curiosity got me and I just kept on sort of going into that. And what I've noticed is over time that sometimes just, that sort of a practice does a lot of the work for me.
Right.
And again, for the principle being that, for me, the main goal of a treatment center is going to be stabilization and preparation for a sober life. The whole thing is not going to happen at the center. Many elements of the future work that the person is going to do are going to happen at the center for some people. Our main job is to stop the madness and then start the skill building for the new life and to, perhaps help the person point themselves towards some meaning and some goals and all those things that support a good life and support recovery. And so if that's what we're trying to do, then let's use all the best notions around what trauma means and what mindfulness means in establishing that. The other thing that really struck me from my early recovery, and then was sort of a little sort of exclamation point was put on it recently, was just how much the Buddhist psychology and mindfulness practice and just all those teachings reminded me of what I was experiencing the 12 steps in the writings and in the meetings where I was meeting the people who were sort of seemed to be on the same path as me. Those of us who got sober in New York City in 1989, we're all like, that was a special time, which I think a lot of people feel about their town and their, their gang that they got sober with. But there were a lot of people kind of starting to explore, these alternative ways of looking at the spirituality. And and so recently, Regina Walker on the fix.com wrote an article called Bill W. and the Buddha. And in that article, she did some research and she unearthed a pamphlet from the early Akron group, like in the 40s, edited by Dr. Bob, who Bill was the one, let's have a seance, let's take some acid, let's see what we can do here to get spiritual. Yeah. And Dr. Bob basically found his Christian faith. I mean, that was as far as I understand from reading the AA history literature, So, but anyway, he edited this pamphlet, and in this pamphlet, it said something to the effect of, I might be paraphrasing a little, but we have looked at the various spiritual traditions of the world, and the one that seems to most closely resemble our 12 steps is the Eightfold Path of the Buddha.
Wow.
In the 1940s in Akron with Dr. Bob in charge.
Wow.
And then he expands on it a little bit, and they say something to the effect of, and this gave me a chill the first time, and I'll probably get a little chill, it won't come over the video, but these principles or this path, and he lays out the Eightfold Path of the Buddha, could easily be a substitute for or an addition to our 12 steps.
Wow. So, that's really interesting how he found those parallels.
Yeah. So when you talk about what you're doing at your center and what we're doing at Refuge Recovery, right. And what Noah and the others Noah Levine and the others who worked on the book Refuge Recovery and developed the alternative to 12-step program aspect of it, what they discovered was, it's, you can look at it from all the different ways. You can look at it, all paths leading to one, or, all spiritual. I used to call 12 steps spirituality's greatest hits. So it's all there. And at the same time, and again, this is maybe because now I've been trudging that path for 28 years, more than 28 years. It just makes perfect sense to me, and it's not just mindfulness, it's the Eightfold Path, which is a path of ethical mindfulness. The program of action piece that we have in 12-step recovery is there in that program, in that path.
So could you talk a little bit about, the Refuge Recovery Centers is based on the Buddhist Eightfold Path, and 12-step, almost virtually everybody else is based on a 12-step model. The Kilby Center isn't, but there's very few that are based on mindfulness and this. So how would you see, or how would you talk about your program being different? What's fundamentally different about yours compared to other recovery centers?
So first of all, if you were interviewing other people who are a part of the Refuge Recovery Centers team, you might get different answers.
Okay. You've
come to the right place for the friendliest answer possible. In as much as, I was at an AA meeting like a couple of days ago. Like I love, that program. I love what it's done for the world. I love what it's done for me. We're not having this conversation without it. When I teach about Refuge Recovery, the meta method, all the things that I'm working on, I always talk about basically the turning point is I have a slide in my presentations, which is a picture of the Sieberling Gate Lodge, where Bill and Bob had their first talk. And I went there. I made the pilgrimage. I was on my way to visit my colleague, Dr. Marich, in Youngstown, which is where she lives. And so I went to Akron, and I literally felt the energy from that conversation, coming out of that building. I might have been projecting, but that's not how I feel about it.
Right.
Anyway, the point being that all of this started there. And what started there was connection between two people and the beginning of the taking of action on behalf of recovery. So, and then, the AA itself and a myriad of programs that have come from it, amazing, beautiful, in a lot of ways, perfectly imperfect, right? So our program is not, we're not 12-step haters. We're not anti-12-step. We're proposing that the structure of a center would be better served with a focus on developing mindfulness practices, in our case, Buddhist mindfulness practices specifically, and getting trauma-focused treatment in your individual therapy, and then also from the perspective of the way the groups are laid out. I mean, the groups, in a lot of the groups don't look that much different than other centers. Uh, the So the idea is, like, many of our clients, and I don't know what the future holds, because Refuge Recovery is very new, the program, and our center is only a couple of years old. I would say, a majority of our clients work both a Refuge Recovery program and a 12-step program. So it's not, it's both and. So I would say that the difference is, the big difference is we don't do any step work. We don't have them doing steps, but we do have them doing some work that is outlined in the Refuge Recovery book. Because it's not just simply the Eightfold Path, here, work it. It's, here's the Eightfold Path translated into a recovery program to help you. And then also there's, to my mind, and this has become harder for me to say, because I'm waiting for the haters to come and start yelling at me about it. But like I said, I was at AA meeting the other day. AA, great program, fantastic. I don't know if it's necessarily treatment. In other words, the clinical, on the clinical side, it is, to my mind, it's a part of a picture for many people, right? And then, I also believe that giving folks the mindfulness skills that we're giving them and starting them on their trauma resolution path, and not discouraging 12-step at all. As a matter of fact, encouraging it for most of our clients, because it's like, if you live in Los Angeles, you're coming to Refuge. We've got, 5 to 8 meetings a week in Los Angeles now, but that, and you don't have that many meetings even in some large cities. Right. So if you're going home to Omaha, and there's no Refuge, we'd be remiss in telling you not to, to pursue it. So it's more about, I guess you could think of it from this Dr. Bob pamphlet perspective, where more than other centers, or different than other centers, we are using the Eightfold Path of the Buddha as a substitute for the 12 steps. And for those clients who are in 12-step programs, we're using it as an addition to.
If we look at trauma as being at the root that needs to be dealt with first, isolation is certainly a part of most people's experience who have addiction. And, the 12-step meetings are so good for connecting with other people, and they're so available, which does make it very valuable. It's a very, really solid piece of the whole 12-step movement, that's for sure. Yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, I'm like I said, the two things that came from Dr. Bob and Bill talking were connection and action, and the connection and the idea of community. And, in Refuge Recovery, or in Buddhism and Buddhist psychology, there are 3 jewels, and the Refuge, I just pretended I had a t-shirt on with this, but the Refuge logo is the 3 jewels, and those 3 jewels are a Buddha, which refers to perhaps the Buddha nature in each of us. It's not the historical Buddha. It's not that kind of thing. Dharma, which is the teachings, and then Sangha, which is community. So community is 1/3, probably more than that of the answer. So absolutely. I mean, the 12 steps, 12-step programs have created that. One thing that just came up for me, though, that's interesting as we're talking about that is my colleague, Jamie Marich, who I've mentioned a few times. So my introduction to her was, she wrote a book called Trauma and the 12 Steps.
I've read that. It's an excellent book.
Excellent book. And I just looked at the title, and I just stalked her by email. I just said, I need to know you. And she said, okay. Scary. And so, and we've been friends and colleagues ever since. But that book, is what we're talking about here. It's how do we fine tune all of the wonderfulness that was created in the 1930s,
Right.
right?
Mm-hmm.
And some people would make the different cases for different things, like you've got to change the language of the book, or you have to do this, you have to do that. To my mind, the greatest thing we need to do is the kinds of things that she outlined in that book, which
Right.
is to make help people, these folks who are avocational helpers, become more trauma informed, trauma sensitive. Look at the reality of, and again, this is totally anecdotal, but I think, I can gather a room of 12-step people and probably get a decent consensus on this, is that so many people relapse on the precipice of the fourth step. And that's because they're being encouraged to go into a trauma-filled world
Right.
without the proper support. And it's not by virtue of like being mean or nefarious or even that badly informed. I mean, a lot of what we're talking about here, we couldn't have this conversation, let alone the computer connection. We couldn't have this conversation 15 years ago, even 10 years ago.
Right.
Having it quite this way. So
let's go into that. So one of the things that I enjoyed about your book is that it works with the helpers, the people who are the addiction workers working in centers, doing that kind of work in 12-step groups or whatever it is. And it would stand to reason that a lot of those people have addiction, at least in their past, some addiction recovery, so probably some trauma as well. And then you get the whole piece of, we need to feel safe enough to go in to do the trauma work. And then what you said near the beginning was that people come into the center and right away they're meditating for an hour and a half. And you mentioned some supports that are necessary for that. So could you just kind of talk about that whole area? Like, what is it that gives people the confidence to know that they're going to be okay to actually go in and do that work around trauma?
So before we went online together here, we talked for a minute about, like that, where let's talk about that which has been done right over the years, and that which we might want to either tune up or just, take what's good and then add what's, as good or better.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that I have had happen consistently in the addiction treatment centers that I've worked at, regardless of how, what the success rate was, and that's another conversation, right? Like what designates success. But the one thing that happened fairly consistently is that the clients said, I feel safe.
Mm-hmm.
And I've never felt that before.
Right.
So there's I think there's a number of factors. I think there's first of all, training staff from top to bottom in being safe people, right? Of understanding trauma enough so that they're not either triggering it or encouraging it or creating new trauma.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And what I've noticed is too that these folks who have said, I feel safe here, they tend to do pretty well. Like just a basic level of safety. So I think some of what we've tried to do is, at Refuge in particular, is to create enough training opportunities so that people across the board understand this model of these two models of the Eightfold Path, Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path as a guiding structure. And then also this structure of the three stages of trauma treatment, mm-hmm. and of the 8 phases of EMDR. So only our therapists need to know how to do EMDR and to do that in the room with the person. But if our other staff know that, they just went through an EMDR session, so they might be a little bit wonky, right? So mm-hmm. either let's keep an extra eye, let's definitely not open it back up, right? Like mm-hmm. don't go pry, hey, so how was that EMDR session? What trauma did you talk about? Want to tell me about your trauma, right? Like, don't open it back up. The meditation practices that they're introduced to at the very beginning. When I was doing my research before we launched Refuge Recovery as a center, I saw there was one center in Switzerland where Vipassana meditation, insight meditation, is the core of their program. And they do, at least what I read, I haven't talked to them, but what I read was that for the first year, they only do breath meditation. So here's the thing, is that the breath is not necessarily a safe and okay place for everybody.
Right, especially with trauma.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
So part of the support is we're not one size fits all in our approach to it.
Mm-hmm.
We make sure that we're watching and listening for people's abilities or lack of abilities to go to certain places and finding the practices that are going to support them.
Mm-hmm.
And really thinking strongly and always about what in this early time are we able to do to start to create some positive neural networks, some resources, some ability. One of my favorite things that I heard from a Buddhist teacher once was, let's find a place in your body that isn't anxious. Is your elbow anxious? Focus on your elbow then, right?
Right.
Finding creative ways to create layers of, building layers of safety and ground for that person. Because trauma treatment is not, the old thought on trauma treatment was like, when people hear me say what I'm saying, oftentimes they'll think, oh, so they walk in and you're like, what's the worst thing that ever happened to you?
Right.
Follow my fingers. No, right? And that is, and again, same thing, not nefarious, not even that ill-informed. Like, it's only been the last 10 years that people have been considering different ways of viewing addiction through the trauma lens.
Mm-hmm.
So now we're at a point where it's like, we're going to take whatever time it takes to create that resilience, and also giving people even the smallest amount of mindfulness abilities in the beginning there makes them into better trauma reprocessors.
Right.
And MDR sessions, which Amy and I feel like we got into pretty good detail in the book, because it's very easy to imagine how mindfulness could help you with stabilization preparation.
Mm-hmm.
And there's some research behind it. And there's been some conference presentations about it, maybe even some writing about how mindfulness is implicated in the reprocessing process.
Okay.
So what we're doing is we're not just giving them skills to, sort of get through a tough time. They're at a party and everyone's drinking. We're also giving them the tools for when, okay, we both agree, and at Refuge, we work as a team, actually, instead of the individual therapist being solely responsible for deciding when it might be a good time to shift from stabilization and preparation to reprocessing. It works together. Every supervisory meeting is about that. So that, any one of these clients that might get to the point where they do feel that level of safety, resourcedness, resilience. They have enough positive material that they can access so that they can go into the darker places. And our assumption is that may happen at our center, and it may need to wait till they're at a lower level of care, lower level of care or upon discharge, whatever it is, but they've started the journey. And so our goal is to create the referral opportunities so they can continue that kind of work. So their vision of their recovery includes that. So that's a little bit about, going back to the creating the safety. So it's in providing them with the kinds of groups that provide that safety, in addition to, like mindfulness-based relapse prevention, mindfulness-based anger management,
Mm-hmm.
You don't do groups where it's like, tell us everything about everything. You know, EMDR therapy posits that all I need from you to do the trauma therapy are the newspaper headlines, and let's work from there.
How does that work in terms of the staff feeling safe enough to be? There's so much trauma that we're dealing with when we're working with someone. How do the staff stabilize and feel safe?
Yeah, I detoured a little from your question. I apologize.
No, that's fine.
So, it happens.
It does.
So I'll start from the clinical staff. So, because with the clinical staff, they are asked to not just read my book, but to read other books and do other study, and to be hyper focused on self-care. That, that's another thing that Jamie and I address in our book, is that if you're not taking care of yourself, how are you, really, you're going to do trauma work with people? You're not going to work out.
Yeah.
So we ask that self-care be a focus. But here's another thing, and I can't speak to somatic experiencing or brains, but any of the other trauma modalities, because that's not my specialty. But EMDR therapy is designed actually in such a way that I find it to be a kinder, gentler, and more sustainable way of doing therapy for a therapist. That the way we structure a session, for instance, is if you're doing a reprocessing session, you only reprocess up until the last 10 minutes of the session. The last 10 minutes of the session is a no-fly zone for reprocessing. We need to resource the person and get them back on the ground, and quite frankly, resource ourselves and get back on the ground. We're not going to go out of our way, like, can you hold on a second? I need to resource here. This was a rough session for me. But, stop the train of trauma.
Right.
Because yes, it does get, I've heard some and seen and been through some crazy things with clients in EMDR sessions. But what I'm saying is that, I've been through some crazy things, and then we resource, and they're ready to go back. So in the end, it becomes more sustainable for me. And the other thing is that I, for lack of a better way of saying it, I see people getting better.
Right.
I'm right. So I had my therapist back in New York for years. His name was Simon, which is the best name for a therapist ever. Simon Says. So Simon said, a good therapist has a lot of ex-clients. So that's kind of the way that I, with EMDR therapy, and I'm noticing, and again, only been at this in this way for a couple of years at Refuge Recovery, where training all the therapists and having EMDR therapy be their primary therapy. Pretty much unanimously, and I don't know if they're just trying to make me happy, I don't think so. They're saying, I feel like I have more energy. I'm able to go home and go to my yoga class and have some dinner. And of course, I still have, because of the level of compassion that helping professionals have, that's still there, but it's not sucking them dry. So that's at the clinic, on the clinical side. And then administratively and with techs and just the rest of the staff, same sort of pattern or message, is that self-care comes first. One of the things that we ask of our of employees is that they go on retreat at least once or twice a year, right? To really engage with their own mindfulness practice, and just try to, if you're having a Buddhist center and you're working at a Buddhist center, you're just going to be surrounded with the stuff all the time, and it's not the 100% answers. Sitting meditation is not what we're saying, but the Eightfold Path, if you break it down, there's the wisdom factors, the ethical factors, and the mindfulness factors. So encouraging staff to engage at all times with all three. which sounds like a real hard job, but it's not. Actually makes everything easier.
A
So
good container really helps.
yes.
One thing I thought was really interesting in your book was when you spoke about the value of meditation in the equilibrium in the mind. And I think it was when you were talking about attraction and aversion, and how so much of addiction is based on attraction towards some state we want and aversion trying to get away from something. Could you talk about that a little bit?
Sure. I don't know if you know people with this experience too, but you buy a Volvo and all of a sudden you see all the Volvos on the road, right?
Yeah.
So I got sober, and like many people who got sober, I immediately thought everybody's an alcoholic or an addict, right? I just look around, you're all addicts, and yeah, which is very attractive.
In a friend, yeah.
Yeah, I meet a lot of friends that way, but
Yeah.
yeah, but the thing is that the Four Noble Truths kind of say it. The Four Noble Truths basically say we're all addicts. The first truth is life contains suffering. And the other translations for that word dukkha include, life can often be unsatisfactory.
Right.
Life is like a wheel where the axle is off just this much, so it goes the thunk, the thunk, the thunk.
Mm-hmm.
And then higher up on the chain, there's old age, sickness, and death, right? And everything in between. So then he's like, all right, this is true. And I can't argue with him. And then the second truth is the cause of all of that is attraction and aversion, right?
Mm-hmm.
Craving and aversion and clinging and unhealthy attachment. Since now we have Western psychology, we need to put unhealthy attachment,
Right.
things to places, to people, whatever. So really, and this is not to then say everyone's an addict, but it is to say that those of us who develop or have or are born with or whatever, it doesn't matter, have the problem of addiction to substances or processes or behaviors. We just get more caught in that web in a very specific way.
Mm-hmm.
And then the third truth is what's the solution? And the solution is, or what can happen with that? And you can actually end suffering. Oh, how can you end suffering? The causes and conditions. You end the craving and the aversion, right? So I've mentioned this in the book, and I talk about it all the time, is just this idea of Buddha as the best psychologist ever, and that he had trouble utilizing the sort of metaphysical verbiage of the time to describe what had happened to him under the Bodhi tree in those 8 days that enlightened him.
Mm-hmm.
And when he came up with the Four Noble Truths, he had basically turned to the science of the time, the medicine of the time, Ayurveda. So first truth is a diagnosis. Second truth is the symptoms and causes. And then the third truth is the cure. You can cure. And then the fourth truth is the prescription, the Eightfold Path.
Right.
So looking at it from that perspective, you then can also help people who are addicted. I feel like this, starts to reduce the stigma, or to help people to understand that they're just suffering, right, on a continuum, and that these practices and to sort of walk this path is a prescription to help them to reduce it. Now, and then if they really want to go for it, they can, go full on into, discovering the possibilities of the enlightenment experience.
Right.
And, dealer's choice,
Right.
all what I would just hope people, killing themselves, harming themselves, and then that great, everything else is gravy after that. I think a lot of clients that I've worked with and sponsees and just my own self, like I've noticed that a little bit of renunciation, abstinence goes a long way. Mm-hmm. Like clean thing, like the people who are like, 30 days in, and it's like, oh, wow, I look better, like I'm eating food, I'm doing all these things. And how much percentage of the recovery is that? It's a lot of it.
Right.
So helping people to see themselves on that continuum and watch them, that they don't have to achieve some sort of perfection, that they can just sort of transform this suffering born of their craving and aversion.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I like, what I like about this practice too is one of the things that I probably would need like hundreds of thousands of hands for fingers to count the times I've heard it, of the people who either report why they relapsed or are preparing to relapse with any addiction is, I'm bored.
Right.
Not, my partner is making me mad, not, just I'm bored. So being able to help people to see that in the category of aversion, right? I'm
Right.
averse to not being constantly excited or high or
Right.
whatever. It's a very helpful framework for some people in early recovery.
Yeah, and it takes a while for the brain and the body to settle. Whether,
Yes.
no matter what it is, if it's, domestic abuse and then you leave the person, you're hooked on the adrenaline and the trauma of it and the crisis all the time. It takes a while just to rediscover your appetite for normal levels of sensory stimulation.
For some people, that's a long process, and it involves a lot of hiccups.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that the more people are consistently being held, that's another thing I love about trauma therapy. And this is both from my own experience as a client and then also providing it and training people in it, is this idea of like, we're not in this march from phase 1 to phase, like with the steps. It's not step 1, step 12, bang, we're done.
Right.
So being able to toggle back and forth. Like if I'm working with a skilled trauma therapist, we're resourcing. Oh, we're ready to go. Let's reprocess. Reprocess, let's say, hit like a really gnarly memory or relationship that I just hadn't noticed in our work doing the history before.
Mm-hmm.
Can we back up a minute? Can we resource again? Oh yeah, let's back up. Resource, let's prepare together. And some of that resourcing, this is another sort of I don't know. Actually, it might have been an earned sort of stereotype of EMDR therapy, of it being very cold and clinical, in the worst sense of the word.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Like, I am your EMDR therapist. Follow my finger. Like rapport has nothing. Like
Right. Right.
and I have some of the therapists that I've worked with. They're like, actually, we had a joke at Refuge for a while. A couple of my therapists are highly trained in narrative therapy. And every time they wanted to, they used narrative work in the sessions, they would like whisper to, I used narrative, I'm like, you can tell, it's all integrative, right? And it's a matter of the central thing and what you're integrating into it, right? So that's all we're doing, just kind of flipping it over. EMDR is the central, and we full narrative and internal family systems and all the other things that you might do. But anyway, so sometimes when people come in, they need a talk session.
Right.
I just need to talk to my therapist.
Mm-hmm.
And that to me is not the end of EMDR. That's where that's a resourcing session.
Right.
I'm still that in the relationship as a therapist. So
And what are your feelings about presence in terms of the therapeutic relationship?
that's my favorite word. It's also Tara Brock's favorite word, or at least her favorite word as it relates to a lot. I've been looking and using a lot of her meditations lately.
Mm-hmm.
And so presence is, same as the Bill and Bob connection and action thing. Presence is, I mean, I don't know if it's still going on in as much as these are the findings, but like for years, the finding was that the important aspect of therapy was not anything other than the relationship. In other words, like, no matter what the technique was, it was the relationship that was providing the healing.
And then
According
we're
to,
circling back to safety again.
yeah.
Yeah.
So
Yes.
presence is all, and I guess that, again, going back to why mindfulness practice, why Buddhist psychology. I mean, it would seem to me that, I mean, you can use Kabat-Zinn's definition, probably paraphrased, of mindfulness, which is present moment awareness, non-judgmental present moment awareness, which is presence. If I'm in the present moment and I'm aware and I'm with as little judgment as possible, is the way I like to teach it when I'm doing a guided meditation, because it really trigger a whole host of different traumas by saying with no judgment. Not really.
Oh, I can't even do that.
That's right. I don't know how to do that. Oh, I suck at this. I quit. I'm running out. Right.
Yeah.
So anyway, so using that definition, or even just looking at, again, the Eightfold Path and what it's designed to do, create, the last two factors of the path are mindfulness and concentration. And what's that about? You're endeavoring to become or get into presence, become presence,
Right.
become present. So I think that's everything, and I think that Buddhist mindfulness focus just creates that as a byproduct.
If there's somebody that's new to recovery or struggling in recovery, or someone who's working with people who are in recovery, what do you feel are a couple of really important things for them to start with?
So I think that there's a couple things. One is, go where it's warm. Trust your gut, because that's something that you might not hear sometimes. And honor yourself and your experience, and I'm trying to think, like, from this trauma-focused perspective, the language that we use in EMDR therapy, it used to be big T trauma and little t trauma. And now it's trauma and adverse life events. In other words, whatever your experience has been to the new person and to the person working with new people, whatever your experience has been, it's valid, and it had that effect on you.
Right.
And there's no hierarchy here. There's just you and your experience and how it has affected the way that you relate to your mind, to your body, and to the world. So seeking out whatever opportunities you can for being able to go inside in a safe way with guidance, doing whatever you can to acquire some of the basic wisdom that is out there, whether it be Buddhist wisdom or 12-step wisdom or the wisdom of CBT, whatever it is that speaks to you, and oh, I could look at it this way. And then seeking community. And that's going back to the go where it's warm. Like, you have the right to choose your communities. You have the right to say that this is okay and this is not okay as you progress into your recovery. And I'll share this too, is the other thing that I love about EMDR therapy, and they're not the only ones who say it, but I, as the professional, I don't do anything. Your brain heals itself. I am just a facilitator who has some skills and techniques and therapies and theories that seem to pan out, that all lead to your, as the client, healing yourself. Trauma from the Greek means unhealed wound. And so your brain heals itself much the way when you got an owie on the schoolyard, and got that scrape, and you did all those things that you needed to do. You know, gave it air, you cleaned it, you gave it air, you know, and then what happened? It scabbed and scarred or didn't scar on its own. So our psyche does the same. Our spirit does the same. So find spaces where people honor that.
Yeah, those are all very important.
And then to quote the first person who gave me my meditation lesson, my very first meditation lesson was, and this is early recovery, you know, stern Buddhist monk in robes, bald head,
Yeah.
very tall. I'm sitting on the ground. And he told us, he said, Zazen, which literally means sitting Zen, because that was the form of meditation. He said, Zazen, sit down, shut up, don't move. Ding. So find the less traumatizing version. You know, this is 1989, so people have trauma-informed Buddhist meditation instructions. But, you know, give it a try. Even if you are thinking, or there's a three-ring circus going on in your mind. If you can just sit down with a bell going off at the end 5 minutes later, and do that for 5 minutes a day, it's going to help you in your recovery. And finding a little bit of guidance, whether it's from books or people, in how to sort of continue that and expand on that. It's more about the practice. 5 minutes a day is better than 30 minutes on Saturday and none the rest of the week.
That consistency. Yeah.
Yeah.
And then people get to know that it's okay. They're going to survive that 5 minutes. Yeah. And it's not the same 5 minutes all the time. Yeah.
It's not what?
It's not the same 5 minutes. It's different.
No.
Day to day.
Every time is different.
Well, cool. Well, let's talk about how people could learn more and get a hold of you. So what are the websites, the book names?
So the websites are Refuge Recovery Centers, plural.com, is for the rehab. DrDansiger.com, DrDansiger.com, has everything I'm doing, from the training to working with Refuge to the books to everything else. And the book titles are Clinical Dharma, A Path for Healers and Helpers. And that has been out since October of last year. And the one upcoming is EMDR Therapy and Mindfulness for Trauma-Focused Care, which will be out on Springer Publications, November of 2017.
Cool. And are you doing that one with Dr. Marich as well?
That one that's already done, and just we're about to get our proofs back. Very exciting. But that's myself and Dr. Marich together.
And her book you referred to was Trauma and the 12 Steps?
Yes, Trauma and the 12 Steps is a wonderful book. And while we're talking about it, she also wrote EMDR Made Simple, Trauma Made Simple, and Dancing Mindfulness, which is her program of mindful movement, where that facilitates and creates facilitators who then embodied mindfulness.
Right. So is there anything that we missed that you'd like to say before we finish?
I think we covered it. I would say that I would love for us all to work together in the recovery community in the spirit of both and working with all of the different best practices that we discover with each other and from each other, and see if we can turn this cruise ship around a little bit. And it's a cruise ship, so it's going to take time to turn it around. But I guess, I look at this as, the opioid epidemic is an expression of addiction as a whole, and when we get to the bottom of it, it's a trauma epidemic, and that anything that we can do to both, put the bandages on the bleeding that's happening, that's, doing so much harm, and at the same time looking at these deeper issues that so many wonderful researchers, theoreticians, speakers, clinicians have seen, that
Right.
if we can make some headway into helping people to develop skills like mindfulness skills, ethical mindfulness skills, and give them trauma resolution opportunities, that's going to be how the ship fully turns around.
Right.
My hope is that this summit and others like it can help people to really engage in this dialogue in a way that helps to end some suffering.
And there'll be a number of different audiences that are listening to and watching these interviews, and certainly people who are working in the field will be part of that audience. And I can't even tell you how excited I am about the different people that I've talked to. I mean, there's some amazing work that's going on. And whether it's, I was talking to someone at the North Carolina Harm Reduction Coalition who works with the police and different agencies, and how they're really changing. And they've given up on the war on drugs. They're not doing that anymore. And they're really changing what the approach that they have at a really holistic core level. And so, and all of the different people that are, someone's doing an arts program, there's just so many exciting things that are going on. And to have a recovery center, and more than one now, that are working trauma first and mindfulness based. And it's really exciting to see all of that start to happen.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Agreed.
Yeah. Cool. Well, thank you very much for being part of this. This has been really fun to talk with you. I'm glad we got your voice into this. Go to KillibyCenter.com, Radical Recovery Summit, to see the full schedule of speakers and to register to watch these free online September 23rd and 24th in the Radical Recovery Summit 2017.